Hi there, Dom from Owls and Towers here. Really excited to be bringing you an interview with September's Author of the Month for Sci-Fi, Christopher Paolini, author of To Sleep in a Sea of Stars. Christopher's answered a couple of pre-recorded questions in which we've sent over to him, and we've got some really interesting answers and some really interesting questions that we hope you're going to enjoy. We're also going to be running a competition. Christopher was kind enough to send us over a copy of his book in paperback, which has been hand signed by him. So please look out for that competition on our social media. Enjoy.
We have selected To Sleep in a Sea of Stars as our fantasy book of the month, and our subscribers will be starting the book now. What should they expect from this book?
Spaceships, lasers, explosions, adventure, heartache, romance, and above all else, I hope a sense of awe and wonder. I wrote To Sleep in a Sea of Stars as a love letter to the genre of science fiction, and I hope that's how it comes across to you.
How did you embark on building this vast world? With the history, the races, and the story, we wonder what came to you first.
What comes to me is always the story, because that's my reason for pursuing the world building. I don't world build without a reason for it. And some people do. They just create vast imaginary worlds and don't really tell a story in it. But for me, it's the story that gives me the reason to pursue the world building. Once I know there's a reason to build out the races and the social structures and everything else, I always begin with whatever is different on a fundamental level from reality as we know it. In fantasy, that might be magic or gods or what have you. In science fiction, it's often technology or aliens. But ultimately, what is physically possible in this setting? So can we travel faster than light? Do we have artificial intelligence? What sort of weapons do we have? What does the technology allow for in terms of travel and fighting and living and all sorts of things like that? Once I have an idea of what's possible, then I can start thinking about, how people would actually live with that, interpret it, how it's going to shape reality as it actually exists. Also, my approach to this was that reality and society as we know it is incredibly complex, incredibly diverse, incredibly strange. And I wanted to pack as much of that into To Sleep in a Sea of Stars as I could because, going from a small rural area in Montana to visiting London or visiting New York City or any of the other large cities of the world really was a bit of culture and future shock. And I really thought that in the future, as humanity grows and spreads around space, that is only going to exacerbate, the differences and the contrasts in the way people live and behave and think and create is just going to be fascinating. There's not going to be any monolithic culture because there's too many variables.
If Kira, the main character, was to have a beer, what type of beer do you think she might enjoy? With her adventure, I would say she deserves one.
I say she deserves a couple of beers. If it were me, I would definitely go for like a very heavy stout or lager or something, but that's me. I like dark, heavy beers. But for Kira, I think she would go with a nice light brown ale. I think an ale would definitely be her choice of beer, especially if it were something that were brewed, sort of home brewed at the colony where she grew up, because I would imagine that colonists in the future, human settlers out in space would be making lots of homebrew beer.
I read that upon self-publishing your first book, Aragon, you went on a tour of over 100 schools in medieval attire. This to me shows a wanting to bring visuals and a theater to the reading. Did you always want or imagine Aragon to be visual and in turn be a film, as in the past, or a future TV series?
Well, I'm a very visual person. I started as an artist before transitioning into writing, and I've continued to paint and draw as much as I can over the years, up to the point of doing quite a bit of interior art for my books at various points. So I think in a very visual manner, and in the case of that costume I was wearing, that was a good visual way to get attention for my presentations. But yes, I've always had the idea that Aragon would make a good film or a good television show, and now that Disney Plus is adapting Aragon as a television show, we finally have a chance, I think, to get a really good visual representation of these characters, the story, and the world itself.
Previously known in part for the Inheritance Cycle series, a hugely successful high fantasy series, what led you to move to sci-fi for this book?
Well, I grew up reading as much science fiction as fantasy, and I love both genres for different reasons, but there are also some similarities. Science fiction, like fantasy, is a genre of imagination. You know, there are many stories in both genres that deal with invented places, invented peoples, sometimes invented rules of physics. Fantasy is often a genre that looks backward. It's a very nostalgic genre at times. There are exceptions, of course, but in general. And science fiction is often a forward-looking genre. And I really enjoy thinking about the future that I believe and hope that humanity is going to have out among the stars. And that appealed to me. I mean, there are so many reasons to be pessimistic, but I am hopeful. And I wanted to write a story that spoke to that hope and allowed me to imagine what it would be like to travel out among the stars. Unfortunately, not something I think I'll be able to do in my life, but writing this book was my way of getting to do that.
I have read about your influences, one being cited as J.R.R. Tolkien, who is a massive influence for us too, growing up by a number of his inspirations in Birmingham, such as The Shire. I love maps and fantasy books and read that this is something you took from your inspiration and used in the Inheritance Cycle. How is drawing space maps?
Space maps are a little harder than fantasy maps because a lot of space maps have actual measurements in them, so things have to be to scale, which can be tricky if you want to actually pay attention to that. I was fortunate that my wonderful assistant, Emanuela, helped do quite a number of the maps into Sleep in a Sea of Stars, and she was responsible for the absolutely gorgeous fractal galaxy print that you'll see in the book. I did a number of the images myself, and those were challenging and fun. I really liked having the opportunity to bring the world to life, again, visually, and it was my first time working with digital art, which I found freeing. Since I got an iPad and I use the Procreate app on my iPad, I have produced far more art in the past few years than I have in the past 2 decades. So it was a lot of fun, and I love science fiction maps. I actually got to do some new ones for a science fiction book that I have coming out next year, hopefully next year. We'll see how the editing goes. But even then, it was a blast making these sci-fi maps.
I noticed the audiobook was read by Jennifer Hale, a big name in voicing numerous RPG-style video games. Was this your choice? Are you a gamer?
Jennifer Hale was absolutely my choice, and she is awesome. We were very lucky to get her. Cool little backstory here. Jennifer did some audio work for the Aragon movie tie-in video game where she helped voice the character of Saphira, the dragon. And I crossed paths with her at a convention many years ago, and we had a nice little chat. And then as I was trying to think of someone who could read the audiobook for To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, because the main character is a woman, I wanted someone who could do that character justice, and I was racking my brains out, and it was actually my dad who said, hey, well, we need someone like Jennifer Hale, and I said, well, I could message her on Twitter and see if she's interested, and that's exactly what I did. The cool thing is that To Sleep in a Sea of Stars is actually the first audiobook that she ever read, and I think she did an amazing performance. She actually won an award for Best Audiobook of the Year performance with that. So I'm very, very happy with Jennifer's performance. She's a lovely person, and she did so much to bring the characters and the world alive in the audiobook.
Finally, what is next for Christopher Paolini, if you can give our readers any insight?
Well, as has been announced, Disney Plus is working on a television adaptation of Aragon, and hopefully the rest of the Inheritance cycle. I'm going to be executive producing as well as co-writing the show. On top of that, I have 2 books coming out next year, or should be coming out next year. One is science fiction and is actually a prequel for To Sleep in a Sea of Stars, and the other has dragons in it. So I think if you like my fantasy work, you're definitely going to like that one. And aside from that, it's just staying busy, reading books, writing as much as I can, and being grateful to everyone who reads my books. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy my future ones as much or even more.
We pair beer from local breweries with books as a monthly experience, as we personally have a little ritual to starting a new book of opening a cold one. Do you have any reading or writing rituals?
I like to listen to music while I write. I very much like to have a cup of warm, if not hot, coffee in the morning and in the afternoon. I really like cinnamon tea later in the day when I'm not so, when I don't want to be quite so caffeinated. And if I'm writing by hand, I'll often use a fountain pen and a nice leathered notebook. Otherwise, I'm on my typewriter or on my computer. But those 3 things that really put me in a writing mood. A good cup of warm coffee, a nice pen, a nice typewriter, a nice computer, and some good epic music playing in the background.